They say blood is thicker than water, but no one tells you what happens when that same blood curdles. The moment you become inconvenient to the family narrative. I found that out on a Tuesday afternoon, 11 days after I brought my daughter home from the hospital, when my father looked at the tiny, sleeping bundle in my arms and told me, without a flicker of hesitation, that she would be better off raised by my brother and his wife. Then when I said no, he raised his hand and struck me across the face in front of my own child. That moment split my life into a before and an after. And what I did in the after is the reason I'm telling you this story tonight. I need you to understand who my father was before I explain what he became. Growing up, Richard Callahan was the kind of man who commanded a room without raising his voice. A retired contractor who built half the houses in our county and believed, with the certainty of Scripture, that respect flowed one direction only, downward, from him and never back up. My older brother Marcus was always the golden child, the one whose failures were reframed as ambition and whose successes were celebrated like national holidays. I was the quiet one, the daughter who was expected to be grateful for scraps of approval and never ask for more. I spent 31 years learning how to make myself small enough to survive in that house, and I thought foolishly that having my own family would finally let me exist as something other than an afterthought. Marcus and his wife, Diane, had been trying to have children for 6 years. 2 rounds of IVF, 3 miscarriages, a silence around the topic so heavy it had its own gravitational pull at every family dinner. I ached for them, genuinely. I sent flowers after the second loss. I sat with Diane in her car, outside a funeral home when we buried her mother, and she cried about babies she'd never hold in, the same breath as grief for a parent she'd lost. I loved them. I want that on the record. Because what happened next had nothing to do with love and everything to do with entitlement. When I got pregnant, unplanned at 34, with a man I was dating but not yet married to, my father's first reaction wasn't concern for me. It was calculation. I watched it happen in real time. The way his eyes shifted when I told him. The way he glanced toward Marcus before he even looked back at me. He asked if I was sure I wanted to keep it. He asked if I had thought about what was fair to your brother. I remember, standing in his kitchen, one hand instinctively pressed to my stomach, feeling something in me go cold and still, like a lake freezing over in a single night. I didn't understand yet what he meant. I would understand soon enough. The pregnancy was hard. My daughter Eleanor came 6 weeks early, and I spent 9 days in a hospital hallway outside the NICU, watching her fight to breathe in an incubator, bargaining with a God I wasn't sure I believed in. My partner, James, and I took turns sleeping in a chair that destroyed both our backs, surviving on vending machine coffee, terrified in a way that reorganizes your entire nervous system. My father visited twice. Both times he stood at the incubator, glass with his hands in his pockets, and said almost nothing about Eleanor. Instead, he talked about Marcus and Diane, about how they'd just finished converting their guest room into a nursery, about how Diane had cried when she saw a onesie in a store window. I remember thinking, even then, half delirious with exhaustion and fear for my daughter's lungs, that he was building toward something. I just didn't want to believe what it was. 11 days after we finally brought her home, my father showed up unannounced. I hadn't slept more than 90 consecutive minutes in nearly 2 weeks. My body still felt like it belonged to someone else. James was at work and I was alone in the living room, Eleanor asleep against my chest, when my father sat down across from me and said the words that I will hear for the rest of my life. He said Marcus and Diane deserved this child more than I did. He said I was young, unmarried, financially unstable, and clearly overwhelmed, and that giving Eleanor to my brother would be, in his words, the selfless thing to do. He said it the way you'd suggest returning an ill-fitting sweater. He had, I would later learn, already discussed logistics with a lawyer friend about private, informal adoption arrangements between family members. My daughter was 11 days old, and my father had already begun drafting the paperwork to give her away. I said no. I said it quietly at first, because I was still trying to process that this was actually happening, that my own father was sitting in my living room, asking me to hand over my newborn like she was a family heirloom being redistributed to whoever needed her more. When he told me I was being selfish and emotional and that I owed this family something, My no got louder. I stood up. I told him to leave, and that's when he crossed a line that no apology, no excuse, no amount of family history could ever put back together. He stood up too, grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, and when I pulled away and told him he was never touching my daughter, he struck me across the face with an open hand, hard enough that I stumbled backward and had to catch myself against the wall to keep from falling with Eleanor still in my arms. The silence after that slap was the loudest sound I have ever experienced. Eleanor woke up screaming. My cheek was on fire, and my father stood there breathing hard, looking not at his daughter whom he'd just struck, but at his granddaughter, like he was still calculating whether this changed his plan or simply confirmed it. I want to tell you that I screamed, that I threw him out with righteous fury, that the scene played like the climax of a movie. It didn't. What actually happened was quieter and I think more dangerous for him. Something inside me went very still. I looked at this man who had spent my entire life teaching me that my worth was negotiable, who had just hit me while I held my own child, and I felt 3 decades of conditioning simply detach and fall away. Like a rope finally cut, I told him in a voice that didn't shake to get out of my house and never come back. He laughed. He actually laughed, and said I'd come to my senses once I realized how hard this would be alone. Then he left unbothered, the way men like him always leave, certain the world will rearrange itself back around their comfort eventually. It didn't. The first thing I did, once James got home and I'd stopped shaking long enough to speak clearly, was document everything. Photos of the bruise forming on my arm and the mark on my face. A timeline written that same night while it was fresh, of everything my father had said and done, dated and detailed. James, God bless him, didn't try to talk me into forgiveness or family peace. He sat beside me while I filed a police report for the assault, and he held Eleanor while I gave my statement, my hand still trembling around the pen. I want to be clear about something, because this is the part where a lesser version of this story would turn into a bloodbath of retaliation, and that was never who I wanted to become. I didn't want revenge shaped like cruelty. I wanted something sturdier. I wanted the truth, documented and undeniable, standing where it couldn't be argued away at the next holiday dinner. I wanted boundaries with teeth. I consulted a family law attorney the following week, not out of vindictiveness, but because I needed to understand exactly what my father's informal adoption conversation with his lawyer friend had actually set in motion, and whether Marcus and Diane had been complicit in it. That answer came a few days later, in a phone call from Diane that I will never forget. She was crying, apologizing, telling me she'd had no idea my father intended to approach me the way he had, that she and Marcus had talked about adoption only in the abstract, grief-stricken conversations, never imagining our father would try to broker it like a business deal without my knowledge or consent. I believed her. Marcus called an hour later and said almost the same thing, his voice tight with something that sounded like genuine horror. Whatever my father had done, he'd apparently done it entirely on his own, convinced that if he simply presented Eleanor as a solution, everyone would fall in line the way they always had. That's the part that still sits heaviest with me. Not the slap, though that certainly left its mark. It's the realization that my father had spent so many decades successfully overriding my autonomy that he genuinely believed he could hand my daughter to someone else and I would simply accept it, the way I'd accepted everything else. He wasn't prepared for a version of me that said no and meant it. The assault charge moved through the system slowly, the way these things do. My father hired a lawyer, tried to frame it as a misunderstanding between a stressed grandfather and an exhausted new mother. But the timeline I'd written, that first night, the photos, the police report, the fact that Marcus and Diane both confirmed under questioning that they'd had no consensual arrangement with our father regarding Eleanor, all of it built a wall of truth he couldn't talk his way around. He was ultimately convicted of misdemeanor assault, given probation and a mandatory anger management program, along with a restraining order I requested that kept him a defined distance from me, from James, and most importantly, from Eleanor. I didn't attend the sentencing to gloat. I attended because I needed to see with my own eyes a system finally saying out loud what I had known quietly for 31 years. That what he did to me mattered, that it was real, that it had consequences. I sat in that courtroom with Eleanor's photo in my wallet and I felt Something unclenched in my chest that had been clenched since childhood. The family fractured, as families like this often do when the person everyone orbited finally faces gravity of his own. My mother, who had spent decades making herself invisible to survive my father's temperament, finally left him 8 months later, moving in with her sister 2 states away. Marcus and Diane distanced themselves from our father almost entirely, horrified at what he'd tried to engineer, and instead became 2 of the most devoted people in Eleanor's life, not as substitute parents, but as the aunt and uncle they were always meant to be. Diane cries sometimes when she holds Eleanor, and I've learned to let that grief and that love exist in the same room without feeling threatened by it. Because real love, the kind that isn't transactional, doesn't need to take what belongs to someone else. My father, as far as I know, still believes he did nothing wrong. I've heard secondhand that he tells people, I turned the family against him over one bad moment. That's the story abusers tell themselves, the story that lets them sleep at night. That accountability is betrayal, that consequences are cruelty, that the people who finally stop absorbing their damage are the real villains. I don't need him to understand what he did. I needed him to stop being able to do it to anyone else, and that boundary now has a legal document behind it. Eleanor is walking now, stubborn and loud and utterly herself, and every single day, I watch her move through the world like she's certain it belongs to her. I think about how close I came to raising her inside the same quiet erasure I grew up in, and how instead, I get to raise her inside a house where no one gets to decide her worth for her. That is the whole of what this was ever about. Not punishment, not revenge. Just refusing, finally, to let someone else's entitlement be mistaken for love. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your own child, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below and tell me the moment you finally stopped shrinking yourself for someone who never deserved the space. Use the word guardian if this story struck close to home, so I know how many of you have stood exactly where I stood. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, real emotional battles fought and won not with rage, but with quiet, unshakable resolve, and stay close, because next week's story is one you won't want to miss.